George Papadopoulos, a foreign policy advisor to the Trump campaign. Thank you so much for being with us. You write about the meeting you had with the Maltese professor, Joseph Misfood. He said to you, the Russians have dirt on Hillary Clinton. He says they have thousands of emails. Revealing what? As an American citizen, I'm horrified. How horrified? So horrified that you went and told authorities?
That's a great point. And I told the FBI, volunteered actually, the information to the FBI during my first interview with them, that a Maltese man named Joseph Mifsud told me this information.
Okay.
You should look into him.
But George, you did not go to the FBI or local police or anybody with the information that someone came to you with information that the Russians had Hillary Clinton's emails, correct?
That's correct.
Maybe I'll say something good. Okay.
Putin used it to pour scorn on anyone associated with Washington's dirty dossier. People who cook up hoaxes like that, he said, are worse than prostitutes.
Here's what I think happened to the United States in the past 8 years.
Carter Page is an individual who the president-elect does not know and was put on notice months ago by the campaign.
He ended up polarizing the country in a way that brings us close to fascism.
U.S. officials tell CNN that last year, the FBI used a dossier of allegations of Russian ties to Donald Trump's campaign as part of the justification to get approval to secretly monitor Trump associate Carter Page.
And in accompanying that, trains Republicans to just hate rule of law.
So let's walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I want to thank you all. God bless you, and God bless America. Thank you all for being here. This is incredible. Thank you very much.
What happened was in April and May of 2016, George Papadopoulos ran his mouth to some Australians.
Information provided by former Australian diplomat Alexander Downer has been revealed as the tipping point that led the FBI to investigate Russian interference in the 2016 US election.
Also to some Israelis and some Turkish people, but the Australians are the ones who matter.
He thought the Russians might release information that could be damaging to Hillary Clinton's campaign at some stage before the election.
When he said that in April and May, nothing happened. But then
Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing.
the Australians were like, wow, that dude, that coffee boy that we spoke to in April and May,
I have no idea why he was blabbering this.
he seemed like he had advance warning of what just happened.
He didn't have to tell me that. I had no idea what he would say.
So that's when they reach out to the FBI.
All we did was report what Papadopoulos said.
Peter Strzok hops on a plane and says, tell me what happened.
So Donald Trump, with his own words, brought this investigation down on himself?
According to what the foreign government told us, yes.
And that's what leads the FBI to open what's called an unsub. Sometimes you have an investigation and you know, we're investigating Paul Manafort or we're investigating Hunter Biden. In this case, they said, it seems like the campaign has some tie to Russia. We don't know what it is.
I have no idea why he was blabbering this. But
Let's open an unsub and try and figure out who it is. And the first 4 people that they targeted in that were Carter Page.
Well, it's ironic in a lot of ways.
George Papadopoulos.
To my recollection, I never heard the name Podesta DNC.
Paul Manafort.
It's absurd. There's no basis to it.
And Mike Flynn.
Didn't take any money from Russia, if that's what you're asking me.
Well, then who paid you?
George Papadopoulos was easy. He was the one the tip came from originally. But
the campaign was fully aware of what I was doing, that I was talking with Mifsud, and that this person could potentially organize a meeting for us with Putin.
They really didn't think that he had any role in it. They thought
He was the coffee boy.
he heard it somewhere else. Carter Page made a lot of sense.
Former foreign policy advisor to the Trump campaign, Carter Page.
Starting years ago, Russian intelligence, he's a former Navy guy, right? Russian intelligence had started cultivating him. And until 2013, the CIA would go to him and say, hey, do you have these Russian friends? And he would tell them what was going on with his Russian friends.
Well, it's funny. Back right after the Boston bombing in the first half of 2013, I was helping the FBI with a particular Russian spy case in New York.
That stopped, by the way, in 2013, which Republicans don't want to talk about.
I wrote an op-ed, which was actually very critical of the Obama administration's policy. there was both a, calling people out for some of their mistakes in terms of this this academic article, which got no real attention other than me talking to the FBI agents about it.
But the Russians kept cultivating him. So in 2015, DOJ indicted the guys who were trying to cultivate him, and in the process included a description of him such that he recognized it.
I had no forewarning that this would be taken to the next level in terms of making this a public indictment and actually filing these charges. Not a very professional way of managing that case, and or recognizing someone who had long supported the U.S. intelligence community and the justice system for many, many years, just really essentially putting my life at risk.
In 2016, they said, hey, we're going to prosecute the Russian spies that were trying to cultivate you. Can we talk about that? And in the process of that interview, hypothetically in preparation for a trial, Carter Page said, yeah, I went to Russia and told them that I didn't narc you out. I told them that I wasn't your snitch.
I had a philosophy at the time that it's useful to tell the truth.
So what the FBI learned then was that Carter Page knew he was being cultivated. When he learned that the FBI had found out about it, he went to the Russians and said, it's not my fault. I didn't do it.
It's an ongoing sort of spy thriller, if you will.
And that led the FBI, sort of understandably, to say maybe Carter Page is doing this willingly. And they opened some kind of investigation into him in March of 2016.
Well, it's funny.
And really importantly, at that point, the investigation was not about politics. The investigation was about economics.
And again, I had supported them and given them a lot of accurate information.
The Russians had asked him for economic information. Remember, he was a business consultant, and he gave them non-public, non-classified information. So, and later on, he would say to the FBI, I think that's good. I think it's okay to share non-public information with known Russian spies.
I'm a free markets guy.
And that's the kind of thing that makes the FBI go nuts. So when Carter Page rushes off to Russia in July of 2016, they know he met with some senior people. There's the Steele allegation he met with others. He clearly is pro-Russian.
It's a very long, complicated story.
And so in August of 2016, when they're like, who could have advance notice that Russia would have these emails and we're going to release them? Well, Carter Page is an obvious choice, right? Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think it is.
And there's Paul Manafort. They had an existing money laundering investigation into Paul Manafort about bringing in the money that he had earned from his Ukrainian oligarchs.
One other thing we learned is that Paul Manafort was under federal investigation since January of 2016, which is well before he was hired to be Trump's campaign manager, and he was being investigated for potential money laundering with Ukrainian money.
In that case, it was just like, let's lump this existing investigation into Paul Manafort, into the question of whether he found out about it in advance.
There's no base to it.
And then finally, Mike Flynn, we had talked about that RT gala that he attended.
That's Flynn, a retired lieutenant general who would become President Trump's first national security advisor, seated next to Vladimir Putin at a 2015 dinner in Moscow.
So he was at a table with Vladimir Putin. He was taking money through his speaker's bureau from Russia.
A speaking event. It was a speaking event.
There was another instance where another Russian company had paid him money to come speak through his speaker's bureau. And then, importantly, he had a relationship going back some years, I think 2013, with his then counterpart, the head of GRU.
A hacker with the alias Guccifer 2.0 managed to break into the DNC's email servers, but he was very careful whenever he went on the internet to hide his real identity when he went online without first enabling that VPN. And the IP address they saw went right back to a building in Moscow as the headquarters of the GRU.
So he had a relationship with the head of the intelligence agency that hacked the DNC. And they're like, well, maybe it's Mike Flynn. I mean, he's got friends in this area. And that's how they come up with him.
Russia had offered to assist electing someone to be president of the United States. From an intelligence perspective, I can't think of anything more significant.
The investigation into Paul Manafort really remained a money laundering investigation and didn't do a whole bunch in that time period.
According to the indictment, Manafort and his associate Rick Gates earned tens of millions of dollars for their work in Ukraine. they funneled it through offshore accounts, evaded taxes, and used it to buy high-end real estate and luxury cars.
The investigation into Mike Flynn, very importantly, didn't do much at all, partly because at that point, August, right, Paul Manafort was ousted shortly thereafter.
It's absurd.
Carter Page was ousted in late September.
This is a real game changer if it turns out to be true.
George Papadopoulos ousted in October.
I never met with a single Russian official in my life knowingly.
Mike Flynn is the one who is still on the campaign and increasingly in a serious position with Trump. And there was this sensitivity with him.
I was appointed twice by President Obama to two very, very important positions, one of which was to head one of the largest intelligence agencies in the world, and twice fully confirmed, 100% by the United States Senate.
You actually have Peter Strzok in late 2016 saying, no, don't take those investigative steps.
The FBI turned up nothing incriminating on him.
Peter Strzok several times held back the investigation.
So were you ready to close your investigation of Flynn?
We were.
That he has since been demonized for starting.
Peter Strzok. Remember, he and his lover, Lisa Page.
So that leaves George Papadopoulos, the coffee boy, and Carter Page. With Papadopoulos, they mostly used informants. They sent a guy named Stefan Halper, who seemed pro-Russian on its face, who had long-term ties as an informant, who actually was introduced to the campaign by Carter Page, hilariously.
It's ironic in a lot of ways.
He met with Papadopoulos a few times, and Papadopoulos said to another informant, that guy's reporting everything I said back to him to CIA. So he believed he was being surveilled, and he shaded his answers accordingly. He said, being involved with the WikiLeaks hack and leak, that would be treason.
You were trying to protect the president. Of course.
To the other informant, however, he said, yeah, I don't want Trump to win. I just want to exploit my access to him. I can make the most money if he loses, and I can exploit my access to him. Now, remember, George Papadopoulos was also being cultivated by Sergei Milyan at this standpoint.
The Trump team, they realized that we have a lot of connection with Russian investors, and they noticed that we bring a lot of investors from Russia.
They were also investigating the relationship between Milyan and him.
Are you involved in any way with Russian intelligence agents?
Absolutely no.
You've heard that, right?
Of course.
Milyan was offering him, if you get a job at the White House, we'll pay you extra $30,000 a month on the side.
Usually, if I meet top people in the Russian government, they invite me, let's say, to Kremlin for the reception. So, of course, I have a chance to talk to some presidential advisors and some of the top people.
But you're saying you're not a Russian spy?
Of course not.
So with Papadopoulos, literally way late in the investigation, they had not yet collected his call records. Had they done so, they would have known that he had a couple extra communications, but like he had this relationship with Ivan Timofeyev, in addition with Mifsud, the guy who actually told him about this.
All kinds of, from about the moment Papadopoulos joins the Trump campaign, you got all these people all around the world starting to swirl around him.
They didn't know about that. They didn't know about Olga, the fake niece of Vladimir Putin. This was all an informant-based investigation.
With Mr. Papadopoulos, they didn't go to the court. They used human sources.
Which finally brings us to Carter Page.
Finally.
Because of the earlier investigation into Carter Page, he was an obvious candidate. Importantly, the earlier investigation was focused on economic stuff. There are rules in FISA and rules in U.S. targeting, and they say that if you have known contact with foreign spies and it's about something that's not political, you don't have to do political analysis.
At least 2 times that we know of, the FBI has investigated your links with Russians. In 2016, last year, when they went to the FISA court and got a court order and received permission to monitor your communications. And earlier, as you know, in 2013, the FBI interviewed you. You were dealing with a man named Viktor Podobny, who was charged later with being an unregistered agent of a foreign government. So that was 2013. At the time, did you have any idea that Podobny was a Russian spy?
I talk to diplomats all the time.
With Carter Page, they didn't have to say, are we wiretapping him because of the campaign? DOJ-IG got this wrong. DOJ-IG misunderstood a really key part of the way FBI works. They misunderstood that earlier investigation was into whether Carter Page was an agent It's called 18 U.S.C. 951, not whether he was involved in FARA, trying to politically influence. If they fix that detail, then much of the rest of the fights ever since would make sense. Nevertheless, they start talking about wiretapping Carter Page because he's traveling internationally a lot. And so they're like, we want to figure out what's going on when he goes overseas. And they did use the dossier to wiretap him.
There's a different standard when it comes to evidence in court. So all of this false evidence that you've been hearing about myself with the dodgy dossier and other false reports going back through most of the last summer, well, that will have very different implications.
They used two things primarily. They used that Sergei Millian report that Trump and Russia had a conspiracy.
Trump has done significant business with Russians.
And that said there's a conspiracy, so we have to investigate it. And they used the dossier report that said he was meeting with other senior Russians in addition to the senior Russians that were public, and that he might be getting money.
Page called allegations he had secret talks with Russian officials on Trump's behalf nonsense.
I think it's really just a political stunt from the get-go.
Now, one of the interesting things is they also had an informant. They had him talk to, I think this was Halper. And Page said, yeah, I went to Russia and they told me that they're going to give me a lot of money. A blank check, he said.
Page responded, well, I don't know that I went that far. I thought there was some support of, certainly, this trip proved it. Nevertheless, Page later noted during the conversation that some people have warned me, be careful with having too much Russian connection for obvious reasons.
They're giving me a blank check to spend money on a pro-Russian think tank. And that's one of the things that the FBI was chasing, that he told an informant that he was chasing this blank check. Nevertheless, they used the dossier.
Sources say that the FBI Director James Comey has cited the dossier in some of his briefings to members of Congress in recent weeks as one of the sources of information that the Bureau used to bolster its investigation. Now, this includes approval from the secret court that oversees the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, known as FISA, to monitor Page's communications. Comey's briefings to lawmakers stands in contrast to the efforts in recent months by the Bureau and U.S. intelligence agencies to try to distance themselves from that dossier.
The FBI didn't clean up the FISA application when they started to learn how dodgy the dossier was. They started learning in November, December, January, February, and so they never cleaned it up. In fact, the FBI withdrew 2 of the applications against him, but those are the 2 that were filed under Donald Trump. They never tell you about that.
This was all Obama. This was all Biden. These people were corrupt. The whole thing was corrupt, and we caught them. It was the greatest political crime in the history of our country. If I were a Democrat instead of a Republican, I think everybody would have been in jail a long time ago. And I'm talking with 50-year sentences.
Like the stuff that was filed under Barack Obama, the FBI still stands by that. And there's actually a conflict because there are plenty of FBI documents, and I've corroborated this, that say the wiretaps were actually quite productive. Whereas according to DOJ IG, they're like, well, we weren't getting much. Now, let's take a step back and talk about the 4 of these, and then we'll talk about the Carter Page FISA order. You have George Papadopoulos, who tells an informant that he doesn't want Trump to become president. What he wants to do is find a way to monetize it. What he wants to do is go to Israel or go to U.S. businesses or go wherever and get people to pay him for his access to Donald Trump.
I have to be an idiot not to monetize it. Get it? Even if Trump loses. If anything, I feel like if he loses probably could be better for my personal business, because if he wins, I'm going to be in some bureaucracy. I can't do jack. You know?
Paul Manafort wasn't hiding it, right? He gets the job on the campaign and immediately sends out letters to his oligarchs, to the Ukrainian oligarchs, to Deripaska, and says, okay, here I am. How are you going to pay me for this?
So to be clear, Mr. Trump has no financial relationships with any Russian oligarchs.
That's what he said. That's what I said. That's obviously what our position is.
Basically, he contacted his Ukrainian oligarchs and said, well, you can pay me while I work for free. So Paul Manafort was selling his access to Trump to the Ukrainians. Starting in November, we learned that almost immediately after the Republican convention, some Turkish guys meet Flynn in New York And they give his consulting company a gig.
Donald Trump was battling the Gold Star Khan family. He was sinking in the polls, replacing his campaign leadership with Steve Bannon. And that was the story in public. But off stage, Mike Flynn was signing a secret contract to get over $500,000 to advance Turkey's interests, a contract he hid from the Justice Department and which stayed hidden until after the election when the story broke.
Shortly after, they realized that they need to launder the gig. They changed the name. The objective remains the same.
Before Turkey ever paid Mike Flynn any money, he was singing a different tune about Erdogan. Flynn giving a public speech saying that Erdogan, this Turkish leader, was actually problematic because he was allegedly moving towards Islamicism and was too close to Obama.
And the only thing he does for Turkey through this laundered payment scheme is write one op-ed, a Hill op-ed that comes out in November of 2016. That's it, $500,000.
And then that op-ed sat online for months until all this broke. And then that same newspaper added this note. 4 months after this article was published, General Flynn filed documents indicating he earned $500,000 for consulting work that might have aided the government of Turkey. Neither General Flynn nor his representatives disclosed this when the essay was submitted. That's not a normal correction.
Shortly before the trial of his then co-conspirator, he got off on the charges. They revealed that they have a lot of intercepts suggesting that this was much more preconceived than Mike Flynn admitted to, right? But regardless, Turkey looks at Mike Flynn and they say, we give him $500,000 and we have Trump's next national security advisor.
One of the things about power-hungry, greedy people is that, arrogance is their downfall.
Carter Page, she's like, I have access to Donald Trump. I'm going to get a blank check to have a think tank. So all of these guys that were originally targeted are people who were like, how can I sell my access to Trump?
That's obviously what our position is.
And importantly, only Mike Flynn was still part of Trump by the time the investigation really got going. Like, they got rid of Manafort in August, said, we don't want to have anything to do with him. They got rid of Carter Page in September. We don't want to have anything to do with him.
Let's not jump to any conclusions.
They got rid of George Papadopoulos. We don't want to have anything to do with.
I did my best. That's all I can say.
None of them were associated. The only one who was associated with the campaign was Mike Flynn. They were taking baby steps with.
Was given an opportunity, and I took it, and I thought it was a great opportunity.
And so that is the history of the investigation. Importantly, though, here's the thing about FISA. There are two kinds of FISA warrants, or targeting Americans. There are two kinds of FISA warrants. One's about data in motion. So if I send you an email, if I send you a text, if I talk to you on the phone, if I make this recording and it's transferred over the wires, that's data in motion. And that's the base level of FISA warrant. But there's also when they collect on your cloud account or on your apartment, they count as the same thing. It's a physical warrant. And we saw this with Hunter Biden. If they can collect on your cloud account stuff you sent 5 years ago, it's a gold mine. And so with Carter Page, they used both. And this was an issue of sensitivity.
I always refer to it as garbage in, garbage out, right?
The stuff data in motion that they were interested in when he was overseas, that's pretty simple. But you're going to get whoever he's meeting with. And oh, by the way, when he was in Moscow in December, if you believe Konstantin Kilimnik, which you should not, he was wandering around Moscow claiming that he was representing the Trump campaign on Ukrainian issues. So he was doing things that Trump should have been really pissed about. He was making promises to Russia without, as far as we know, any involvement from Trump.
Carter Page, had you, when we spoke before, ever met Donald Trump?
I had never then when we last spoke, and I still have never had the privilege of meeting him. And, it's unfortunately, I just being totally misportrayed. I've been a man on the run.
But the important thing is that data at rest, that cloud access, that got emails from the time he was on the campaign. And that's the entire sensitivity. Now, I think the campaign at that point really cared about not being in the pants of Russia, right?
That's what he said. That's what I said. That's obviously what our position is.
At that point, they realized that it would be toxic. I think they were obviously covering up for the Trump Tower thing.
Can you share what communication the president had with Michael Cohen about Trump Tower Moscow? And can you share the last time they talked about Trump Tower Moscow?
Probably can't do that. I wasn't his lawyer at the time. I can tell you, however, before the investigation, during the period that they're looking at, they did have conversations about it. The conversations lasted throughout parts of 2016. The president is not sure exactly when they ended.
They were covering up probably a bunch of other things about Russia. They were covering up about the June 9th meeting.
Let's run down quickly what we know. Goldstone met Trump through his work as a publicist for a Russian pop star, Eamon Agalarov. It was Goldstone who helped make Trump's dream of bringing his Miss Universe pageant to Moscow a reality. And as I said, Goldstone is also the author of his now infamous email exchange with Donald Trump Jr., in part promising information that would incriminate Hillary, and that the high-level and sensitive information was part of the Russian government's support for Mr. Trump.
And so the easy way, and this is what Trump would do with Mike Flynn later, is get rid of him. Trump has this belief, or did then, maybe he doesn't anymore, that if you just get rid of it, it'll go away. The thing about Trump is that back then, I think he's actually, it's changed this year, but back then, his campaign was like 7 different influencing sides. And so you had Roger Stone on one side and Corey Lewandowski on another.
You know, the problem is everybody dumps people when there's a sign of political incorrectness. Folks, look, I'm a loyal person. I'm going to be loyal to the country. I'm going to be loyal to Wisconsin. We have to tell it like it is. It would be so easy for me to terminate this man, ruin his life, ruin his family. He's got 4 beautiful children in New Hampshire, ruin his whole everything, and say you're fired, okay? I fired many people, especially in The Apprentice.
Corey Lewandowski was trying to get rid of Manafort so he could get back in. Everyone had their own personal super PAC, and that's the way they were getting rich. So you wanted to be back in to get a super PAC. But here's the thing. Again, one of the issues is that people want to get rid of the rival, because if you get rid of the rival, then you can open a super PAC and get rich. And this happened over and over again. Brad Pascal did it in 2020, right?
Meet Brad Pascal. Brad is getting rich. How rich? Really rich. A $2.4 million waterfront house in Fort Lauderdale. 2 Florida condos worth almost $1 million each. He even has his very own yacht.
And that's one of the things I'm trying to say, is that all of these people were trying to make bank on Donald Trump. All of these people.
To the ground, man. Easy. I didn't do anything.
This body camera video shows the takedown of former Trump campaign manager Brad Parscale after a standoff with Fort Lauderdale police at his home. His wife said he had several firearms. The police found 10.
Can you come outside with no weapons, please?
Parscale had become a prominent figure in the president's circle, running the digital side of the 2016 campaign and becoming campaign manager of the 2020 re-election bid until July, when he was demoted.
Obviously, he's offering people this illusion of wealth, and it's a fraud. This is the thing, is he's offering everybody to join in his fraud. He remains a reality TV star. So there are 2 questions. Why do Republicans do it, and why do other people around him do it? And the why do people around him do it is because it's an easy way to money and power. Why do Republicans do it? I keep coming back to it. There are Christian nationalists, people like Bill Barr, who are willing to use Trump as a tool.
Among the militant secularists are many so-called progressives. But where is the progress? We are told we are living in a post-Christian era, but what has replaced the Judeo-Christian moral system? The fact is that no secular creed has emerged capable of performing the role of religion.
Bill Barr, Sam Alito, Pat Cipollone. And then once he became less useful to them, once he had packed the courts, then they were, I'm going to distance myself from your crime.
And I've expressed concern about a second Trump term, and I really point to the secret audio tape that came out that had Bannon talking before the election, saying, and he wasn't aware he was being recorded, telling supporters that that Trump was going to stay in office no matter what, and that a second term was going to be off the hook because he never had to go back to the voters again.
All of the Christian nationalists, except for Sam Alito, did that, right?
We're going to focus more closely now on that New York Times reporting about that appeal to heaven flag seen flying outside Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito's New Jersey beach home last year. The flag was also carried by rioters at the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021.
And this movement specifically believes in Christian supremacy, ending any separation of church and state. And these Christian nationalists have essentially worked since 2015 to get more Republican lawmakers and government officials to fly this flag. And as we reported earlier this year, House Speaker Mike Johnson has this appeal to heaven flag, has put it outside of his Capitol Hill office.
There's the fascists. Maybe Sam Alito is actually a fascist, but there's the fascists who really, the Steve Bannons of the world, who really want to achieve world government of authoritarians.
He seemed to imply that Dr. Anthony Fauci and FBI Director Christopher Wray should be beheaded.
I'd actually like to go back to the old times of Tudor England. I'd put the heads on pikes, right? I'd put them at the two corners of the White House as a warning to federal bureaucrats. You either get with the program or you're gone.
There are people who are opportunistic, the Lee Stefanik's of the world, who say, this is my way to power and I'm going to lie and cheat because that's the way I can enter leadership in the Republican Party and maybe become a VP candidate.
And joining me now is a key Trump ally, Republican Congresswoman Elise Stefanik of New York. As you know, Trump took his case to court more than 60 times that there was fraud. He didn't win. But I want to get back to this key question. Do you still think it was a tragic day? Do you think that the people who stormed the Capitol should be held responsible to the full extent of the law?
I have concerns about the treatment of January 6 hostages. I have concerns.
There are the people who are snowed, the people who believe Donald Trump's lies. Like I did a post on Scott Perry's belief in all of Scott Perry, I think honestly does believe that the Ukrainians attacked the United States, not Russia.
Joining us tonight from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Congressman Scott Perry. He represents the area there, a member of the Freedom Caucus.
This is impeachment number 3. It's attempt number large. Russian collusion, then the impeachment. This is just the 3rd large attempt.
And so I think that Scott Perry, he did this in a House Oversight hearing once.
Many of us, I was one of them, sat in a skiff week after week, day after day. For an impeachment, one of the members of this committee, now, as a staff member then, a staff attorney then, knew there were lies being told to compel the impeachment, to back up the impeachment, to reinforce the impeachment. Lies. Abject, straight-up lies. Not to mention the fact that for years, the other side of the aisle pursued the then duly elected president of the United States based on pure hyperbole about some Russian hoax that has now turned into, it's the same old story from the 1930s in Germany and the 1940s. If you tell a lie enough times, it becomes the truth.
And I believe that man actually buys into all of this garbage. A lot of these people are weak-minded and not very intelligent, and so I think it's easy for them to believe clear fraud. And then, again, we're all Don Bacon's wife. And I say this a lot, and this is my new mantra.
Bacon and his wife, Angie, were college sweethearts. She's appeared in a few campaign ads and at events, but where she finds herself now is unenviable.
Don Bacon, remember, is this moderate from Nebraska, one of the most moderate, if you can call him a moderate, one of the most moderate people in the Republican Party. And when he opposed Jim Jordan for Speaker,
Bacon said his office has received numerous calls regarding his vote for Speaker, most of those coming from outside of the district.
He was treated just like Peter Strzok or Hunter Biden or Judge Merchant.
Phone calls, threats to primaries, and I get all that stuff. It's all right. But you start sending texts to my wife anonymously and calling her anonymously with threats. It's wrong.
One voicemail sent to his wife, which 3 News Now has obtained a copy of, lamented Bacon's lack of support for Jordan.
He is destroying the Republican Party.
Bacon isn't just sharing his frustration with the media.
But Mr. Jordan needs to make clear that this behavior is wrong, and there's been a bullying campaign.
He was treated with the same mob mentality as Trump's other enemies. And he described that his wife slept during that period with a gun under her pillow. Because he had done something very modest, which is oppose Jim Jordan as Speaker, all of a sudden he became the target of a really vicious mob.
American people don't want that.
And people who have felt who've been on the brunt end of that mob, they're either going to choose to fight back, and they're the rare ones, or they're going to choose to hunker down and do nothing to attract attention again. And I think that's the larger number, the people who are terrified by that mob. Peter Meyer, right? He's rich. He's former military.
He was the first freshman, actually lawmaker ever, to vote to impeach a president of his own party.
And when he voted to impeach Donald Trump, he started wearing body armor.
In an interview with Politico magazine, Meyer said he'll now support whomever the 2024 GOP nominee is. Amid little doubt, it's likely to be Trump. And he's doing more than that for the former president. He submitted a court filing arguing that Trump's name should be allowed to appear on Michigan ballots amid debate over whether Trump is disqualified from the presidency because of his conduct on January 6th.
Mitt Romney, right? Rich, voted to impeach, and started hiring security because he could.
Now to Utah Senator Mitt Romney. The 2012 GOP presidential nominee announced he will not run for re-election next year and will retire from the Senate.
Everyone besides Peter Meyer and Mitt Romney can't afford that personal security to defend against the mob, and so many of them capitulate. Many of them just get terrified and give in. It is terrifying. It is absolutely terrifying. And I talked to a lot of people who've been the primary victim, not the most obvious. I've never spoken to Hunter Biden.
The New York Post has already published aerial photographs of where I live.
That's not why I do the Hunter Biden stuff. But I've talked to other key victims of this story, and most of them are like, I have managed to rebuild my life after being targeted by Donald Trump, and I'm not willing to invoke that wrath again. If everyone who had been targeted by Donald Trump came out on the same day and said, I'm not going to do it anymore, none of us are going to do it anymore, there'd be too many targets for the mob, right? There'd be too many people for the mob to hit. But Donald Trump just serially targets one after another person, and they become the focus of the mob. And then, like these jurors who just voted to convict Donald Trump, they're being doxxed as we speak. They don't have private security. What is going to happen to these people? What is going to happen to these people when the entire mob of the Republican Party starts going after them? And I don't know the answer to that. And how do we tie that mob violence to Donald Trump? Here's the trick. It actually is genuinely hard, with the exception of one or two people like Tyler Toronto.
A U.S. Navy veteran. He was arrested last week outside former President Obama's Washington, D.C. neighborhood. Nearby, federal agents say they found his van with 2 guns, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, and a machete.
He's a veteran, suffers from mental illness, joined in January 6th, and then one day on Truth Social took the address that Donald Trump himself RT'd for Barack Obama. And then this mentally ill man who had been trained in the military starts stalking Barack Obama's neighborhood.
But there are other issues on the table right now. They're seeking to have Toronto held in jail, alleging he threatened to detonate a vehicle. Against Democratic Congressman Jamie Raskin, who you might recall led the second Trump impeachment.
His January 6 crimes were just trespassing. Same with the guy who attacked the Cincinnati FBI office, by the way.
An armed man who allegedly tried to break into FBI Cincinnati field office was shot and killed by police during an hours-long standoff today. The suspect has been identified as 42-year-old Ricky Schiffer. So what do we know about this man?
According to CNN, a social media account with his name shows a post made referencing an attempt to storm an FBI office. It was published on Truth Social, Donald Trump's platform.
He was being investigated for low-level crimes on January 6th. And then he goes postal one day and kits himself out and tries to break into the Cincinnati FBI office after Trump's house was searched.
Federal investigators say Schiffer might have had ties to far-right extremist groups, including the
Proud Boys. Stand back and stand by.
It's stochastic terrorism. You can't hold Trump accountable because he lied. Now prosecutors are trying to deal with the fact that Trump lied about the FBI having an assassination attempt on him when they went to his Florida house knowing full well he was in New Jersey.
Donald Trump's campaign has used lies without any shame to mobilize and animate and energize its supporters. But believe me when I tell you that this time it's different. Disinformation of a stripe and variety that goes well beyond the size of his crowds or his golf scores. A dangerous lie this time. Trump's entirely false assertion that the Department of Justice authorized the FBI to use deadly force in its 2022 court-approved search of Mar-a-Lago. That lie has exploded. Watch.
This was an attempted assassination attempt on Donald John Trump.
It's just nonsense. Unfortunately, because of the way the First Amendment works in the United States, it's very hard to say to Donald Trump, even as a criminal defendant, especially if Aileen Cannon is presiding over his case, it's very hard to say, you can't lie and in the process ratchet up your mob to attack the FBI office in Cincinnati, to start stalking Barack Obama's house. And there are a good many members of Trump's mob who, at least until the guilty verdicts, had given up the ghost because they saw how many people were prosecuted after January 6th. I think that may change given how much Trump is ratcheting up the grievance. But you're always going to have a Ricky Schiffer. You're always going to have a guy, that one guy who decides to kid himself out personally and go try and take down the Cincinnati FBI office. Or this guy, Tyler Toronto, unwell. I can't count the number of January 6th defendants who have a genuine diagnosed mental illness, or many of them PTSD from fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. And they are much more susceptible to Trump's stochastic terrorism. They just are.
This is Democracy Now!, Democracy Now! The Armed Services Committee of the House held a hearing Wednesday on extremism in the U.S. military to look at how nearly 1 in 5 people who are facing charges related to the deadly January 6th insurrection at the Capitol had served or are serving in the military, including at least 2 active duty troops. One of the experts asked to testify at Wednesday's hearing was Leisha Brooks, chief of staff at the Southern Poverty Law Center, who said the military has long failed to adequately address far-right extremism in the ranks.
Let me begin with 2 distinct points. First, the vast majority of those who serve in our armed forces have no connection to white supremacy or extremism and strive always to uphold the best traditions of our nation's democratic ideals. Second, the military has a growing problem with white supremacy and extremism because our country does.
And so here's the thing. 2 things, right? If it were me and somebody was trying to exploit me like that, I'd be fucking pissed off. Let's talk about Eric Swalwell.
You're aware of something Axios first reported, an investigation going back between 2011 and 2015, that you were among the targets of a woman who was, in effect, a Chinese spy, right, trying to establish contacts with U.S. politicians, rising politicians. I should note to people that you cooperated in this investigation and were given a briefing by the FBI.
This woman who presented as a volunteer, an enthusiastic volunteer for his campaign, was trying to sidle up and get close to him. They were trying to sidle up and get close to him because they expected that he would be a good shot to be an intelligence committee appointee. And this is the story. Like Donald Trump, Eric Swalwell is cultivated by China in 2010. So what happens? The FBI comes to him and says, that nice Chinese lady who is a volunteer in your campaign, she's not working for free.
And I was a little surprised to read about my cooperation in that story, because the story says that, there was never a suspicion of wrongdoing on my part, and all I did was cooperate. And the FBI said that yesterday.
And what Eric Swalwell did in response is exactly what most people would say. Eric Swalwell, oh my gosh, I had no idea. Let me tell you what happened. Let me help you as much as I can. I am embarrassed that I was cultivated like this. Let me do something about it. I'm grateful that you told me that China was trying to recruit me as a spy because I'm on the intelligence committee.
But the wrongdoing here, Jim, is that at the same time this story was being leaked out is the time that I was working on impeachment on the House Intelligence and Judiciary Committees.
Donald Trump learns that the deep state is trying to find out whether his campaign is infiltrated by spies. And what is his response, right? Donald Trump's response is, the deep state's out to get me. Eric Swalwell, spies are trying to recruit me. Oh, let me help you, FBI. I'd like to help you get rid of that. Donald Trump, spies are out to cultivate my campaign. Spies are infiltrating my camp. Oh my God, the deep state is out to get me.
Unelected deep state operatives who defy the voters to push their own secret agendas are truly a threat to democracy.
And that is one of the fundamental issues here, is for 2 reasons most any other human being, except for somebody who has a whole lot to hide, would have been grateful. They would have been grateful to learn Paul Manafort is taking advantage of me.
The technical term for what we do is lobby.
Mike Flynn is taking advantage of me.
We don't care about how others look at us or define us. So
$500,000 in his pocket from Turkey. I think Mike Flynn is advising me on his own good faith, and instead he's working for Turkey.
That article also advocated Turkey's push for that cleric living in Pennsylvania to be extradited. And that's big because later NBC News reported a Turkish bribery plot after the election asking Flynn to help kidnap the cleric for $15 million. Flynn denies it. Meanwhile, once in office, Trump was striking a warm note with Erdogan in the Oval Office.
I think Paul Manafort is advising me in his own good faith, and instead he's working for Ukrainian oligarchs.
Purposes of today, I will admit that in a narrower sense, some people might term it influence peddling.
I think Carter Page is working for me, and instead he's trying to get bang from Russia.
we're all susceptible here.
I think George Papadopoulos is advising me, and he's working with Israel.
They keep bringing up this question of Israel. Israel. You're over there. You meet Charles Tawale. There's money that's discussed at one point, $10,000. It all keeps coming through, and yet for some reason, nobody has talked about your Israel ties before.
My initial interview with the FBI in January of 2017 wasn't about Russia. It was about Israel, and it was about if I had been told about emails.
That it should piss off anybody. It should have pissed off Donald Trump. It should piss off anybody. All these people were exploiting me. It's not just them. Everyone around Trump is exploiting him. They're taking advantage of him. They're making millions off of him, hundreds of thousands, whatever it is. None of them have his own interests at heart. And most human beings would say, thank you, FBI, for alerting me to that fact. And Donald Trump has the exact opposite.
Trump wrote on social media Friday, if you go after me, I'm coming after you.
The important part about Carter Page is out of the campaign. No one cares about him.
Not professional.
Bannon is trying to get him to shut up.
It's ironic in a lot of ways.
But the important thing about Carter Page, the main reason he matters is this is the only real way they used the dossier in the investigation was in that FISA application against Carter Page.
We know they've been spying on Carter Page and not following the FISA rules. How do we know that? Because Inspector General Horowitz has done 2 different audits, 2 different reports that he's given to us.
So it's one reason he matters, because that's the only way you can make the dossier matter. And then the second reason is that because they got the physical warrant, because they accessed his cloud and got stuff he had written in the summer, it meant that they got emails he had written while he was still on the campaign.
They were spying on President Trump's campaign.
That's it. That's the only reason he matters. And they probably found out about it once we get to Louise Mensch. Ooh, Louise Mensch. But first we'll talk about Mike Flynn. So they did wiretap Carter Page after you had been kicked off the campaign, that Carter Page was taking advantage of Donald Trump. They were trying to take care of Donald Trump and national security. They fucked up the handling of the dossier, believing nevertheless that Christopher Steele was credible. And that's how the FBI works. It's like, we've got an informant, we think he's credible. We tell you that we think he's credible, and we're supposed to tell you when we think he's not credible anymore. Fast forward to December. And Russia has attacked the United States.
From an intelligence perspective, I can't think of anything more significant.
And the IC has been trying to figure out how to manage it all along. Like, how do you manage the attack on an election and still honor democratic principles? It becomes public on December 9th of 2016 that the CIA now believes that Russia was helping Trump, not just to undermine the United States, but also to help Trump. And that makes things really contentious. And then Obama orders this report of what happened. That makes things really contentious. That's where the dossier, they share the dossier as an addendum to say, we think this is dodgy, but we need to tell you what came in. And then Obama sanctions Russia. Right.
President Obama today retaliated against Russia for hacking U.S. computers to influence the election. Along with economic sanctions and possible cyber attacks, a handful of people and Russian organizations were targeted. In a statement, the president said all Americans should be alarmed by Russia's actions.
At this point, Mike Flynn's on vacation in Dominican Republic, and there's this panic about what to do. KT McFarland, who's going to be his deputy national security advisor, is talking to him in the Dominican Republic. And he ends up on the phone with Sergei Kislyak. It's not his first call with Sergei Kislyak. But in any event, he has a couple conversations with Sergei Kislyak, and Putin reverses course. We don't know that's what happened yet. But Putin reverses course very publicly and very ostentatiously. And then Trump thanks him equally ostentatiously.
As Barack Obama and Vladimir Putin face off in a high-stakes chess match, Donald Trump tweeted his way in between them Friday, praising the Russian president after he held back and decided not to expel American diplomats, as expected by other top Russian officials. Trump wrote, "Great move on delay by V. Putin. I always knew he was very smart."
And that's when the IC goes, holy shit, what's going on? Their first holy shit moment is George Papadopoulos knew about the hack and leak ahead. Their second holy shit moment is Putin just spun on a dime and we don't know what caused it. And so being spooks, they say, let's figure out what caused it. And so as they were trying to figure out what caused it, they reviewed some intercepts of Sergei Kislyak. So they're targeting Kislyak. Kislyak is in the Russian embassy or his residence or wherever in in Washington. But they're targeting Kislyak. He's a completely fair target. And they're like, wow, we collected these conversations with Sergei Kislyak, who, by the way, probably knew he was being wiretapped. There's a moment where they almost joke about it, where they like talk into the receiver as if they know they're being wiretapped. But they figure out that Sergei Kislyak had these conversations with Mike Flynn. And all of a sudden, like, this is a real holy shit moment. They're just about to shut down the investigation into Mike Flynn. And all of a sudden, they discover that Mike Flynn's on the phone with Sergei Kislyak, undermining the sanction.
That call that jumps out at first, though, is December 29th, 2016, when Flynn talks to the ambassador about Russians in the United States expelled by the Obama administration. Kislyak proposes for President Vladimir Putin to talk to Donald Trump on January 21st, the day after Trump was inaugurated. Flynn says, listen, a couple things. Number one, what would I ask you guys to do and make sure that you can convey this, okay? Do not allow this administration to box us in right now, okay? Kislyak responds, we have conveyed it. They're going to dismiss a number of Russians out of the country. I understand that, the information they have and all of that, but I would ask Russia is not to do anything, because I know if you have some sort of action, to only make it reciprocal. Do not make it go any further than you have to, because I do not want to get us in something that has to escalate on, a tit for tat. You follow me, Ambassador?
And at this point, they think he's a lone wolf. They think he's doing this on his own. They think he got money from the RT Gala. They got money from, Kaspersky, what have you. He's undermining Donald Trump. That's what they think. And then they keep looking and they discover that the conversation goes back earlier.
Multiple sources telling CNN that Russian officials bragged in conversations during the presidential campaign that they had cultivated such a strong relationship with former Trump advisor Michael Flynn that they believed that they could use him to influence Donald Trump and his team.
One former official told me that the way the Russians were talking about Flynn was regarded as what they called a 5-alarm fire from early on.
Their first thing they did was to undermine an effort to sanction Bibi Netanyahu for illegal West Bank settlements. And Flynn gets on the phone and Russia agrees to help out. And so that's when it starts. But the first visible sign of it is when Putin spins on a dime, Trump spins on a dime, and all of a sudden they're like, what happened? And they discover in existing intercepts, like this was not a new intercept. They're like, let's go see. And they're like, oh, here's your answer.
Flynn's relationship with Russia developed throughout 2016, we're told, months before Flynn was caught on an intercepted call in December, speaking with Russia's Sergei Kislyak, the ambassador.
So there's this panic in the government. They're like, okay, the incoming national security advisor is undermining U.S. security. This is like the nightmare of all nightmares for spy stories, that former spy made friends with the GRU comes in and he's undermining U.S. policy.
It's an ongoing sort of spy thriller, if you will.
What do we do about it? And the fact that he was wiretapped, or he was caught on a wiretap, leaked. And to this day, we don't know. One obvious explanation is Congress leaked it. Another obvious explanation is that somebody in the IC said, let's leak it and see how he responds, because this is so urgent to figure out whether he's a spy for Russia. Let's leak it and see how he responds. Or maybe, and I don't rule this out, maybe Trump leaked it or Russia leaked it, because this is the kind of thing both of them would do. When they leak it, Flynn lies publicly. Flynn tells Pence, Nothing happened. Pence goes around, says nothing happened. And that's when things change. And that's the excuse that the FBI says. They're like, it's one thing for him to call up and undermine U.S. policy as the incoming national security advisor. That's one thing. But to lie about it publicly means you're hiding it, right? To lie about it publicly means you're hiding it from somebody. And we have to assume you're hiding it from Trump, too, especially because Mike Pence says he doesn't know about it. And that's when the investigation, that's when they're like, that's when holy shit moment becomes holy shit moment. They're like, okay, the incoming national security advisor may be a spy of Russia. And that's when they decide they're going to interview him. In the interview, he lies repeatedly, not just about the Russian conversations, but he also lies about the the undermining the Israeli thing. And so then they approach Trump and they're like, hey, your incoming national security advisor is in the tank for Russia. They might have, and it might have been smarter to do more investigation, right? But they didn't.
I think we ought to get on with our lives. The whole, age of computer has made it where nobody knows exactly what's going on.
At that point, let's go back. Here's the interesting thing about those intercepts. The entire time Mueller investigated this, he assumed he would never be able to use those intercepts in a criminal prosecution. Because you never can. You can't just introduce a FISA intercept. And we now know what they say because Donald Trump handily released them and released them such that Russia can review them too. But had Mueller thought he might be able to use those transcripts, things might have been different. For example, in one of the conversations, Flynn says to Kislyak, oh, the boss is aware. That tells you that he's had a conversation with Donald Trump about what's going on with his conversations with Russia. In another conversation, the transcripts seems to raise questions about whether somebody's on a speakerphone. When Flynn made the first call, he was in Mar-a-Lago. So imagine if that's on a speakerphone. Then you have Trump in the room. I think the December 28th call, he's in Dominican Republic. He makes the call from his hotel phone. Let me repeat that. This experienced spy makes a call, a clandestine call to a Russian diplomat from his hotel phone. Again, there's reason to at least wonder whether they found a cell phone on his presence that was calling back to Mar-a-Lago, that he was letting KT McFarland or even Trump listen into those calls. The entire Mueller investigation presumes that you can never get any of those details in, presumes that you can only pursue with your investigation what you can get all witness. That's important to know. If Trump thinks that the FBI knows he was on a speakerphone for that first call with Russia, that changes things, right? This was not a wiretap of Mike Flynn or Donald Trump, but it was a wiretap, a long-standing wiretap of Sergei Kislyak. But if Trump is worried about evidence that he was on a speakerphone, that changes things.
The president stated that he wanted to dine with Comey alone.
According to Comey's account, at one point during the dinner, the president stated,
I need loyalty. I expect loyalty.
Comey did not respond, and the conversation moved on to other topics.
But the president returned to the subject of Comey's job at the end of the dinner and repeated, I need loyalty.
You will always get honesty from me.
That's what I want, honest loyalty.
Mike Flynn's interview is January 24th. It leaks. Trump ends up firing Flynn on the 13th.
Sean Spicer today said what cost Flynn his job was not coming clean about those conversations and misleading Vice President Mike Pence about them just before Pence went on television to talk about it all. The White House would not say, and I asked this question specifically, what evidence the White House counsel Don McGahn weighed to determine that there was nothing illegal in those phone conversations. But the FBI is known to have transcripts of electronic intercepts of those conversations.
And the 14th, they asked Jim Comey, can't you make this all go away?
The president began the conversation by saying, I want to talk about Mike Flynn.
The conversation turned to the topic of leaks of classified information.
But the president returned to Flynn. He's a good guy, and he's been through a lot. I hope you can see your way to letting this go, to letting Flynn go. He's a good guy. I hope you can let this go.
Comey agreed that Flynn is a good guy, but did not commit to ending the investigation of Flynn.
This is another example, like Paul Manafort. If I just fire them, it'll all go away.
Now that we fired Flynn, the Russia thing is over.
Please make it go away. It didn't go away. Basically, Trump's go-to since then has been loyalty.
That's what I want.
That is an important thing to know about Donald Trump is he is willing to tolerate you selling him to the highest bidder. He really is. It's insane. Would piss me off. Probably piss you off. I guess for him, it's a way to be a cheapskate. I'm not going to pay my campaign manager, but if he finds a way to, and so many people robbed him from the inauguration committee. It was such a slush. It's all a slush. Now we have to talk about Louise Mensch, but I need to take a break. Any questions?
And joining us now, the journalist who's reporting from last year is at the heart of this growing controversy. Louise Mensch is Vice President, Creative and Strategic Division at News Corp. Mensch is also the former editor of Heat Street, where a November 2016 article she wrote is getting a lot of attention. And reportedly, some of that includes folks at the White House.
Let's talk about Louise Mensch, because to this day, no one understands what to make of Louise Mensch. Louise Mensch was a Tory MP.
Will stand up to Putin, as it's been a bit too much of a love fest tonight. I'll say to Nigel Farage, I think you're sucking up to this genocidal tyrant is absolutely disgusting. This is the man that killed 20-year-old Richard Mays and 10 other Britons that shot down MH17. And
moved to the United States and married a hard rock promoter. And then in February of 2016, she reaches out to Hillary Clinton and says, I want to be part of your campaign. Not entirely crazy for a Tory female to reach out to Hillary Clinton. It's not entirely crazy.
Never forget, you must make up your own mind. You must learn to examine things. You must learn to think about them.
But it's still suspect. And over the course of this burgeoning concern about Russia, Louise Mensch becomes one of those people who can roll out these 200-word tweets, taking some nugget and spinning it into an entire conspiracy.
Today, she set Twitter on fire. She's claiming that right before Donald Trump flew off to Saudi Arabia on his Air Force One plane, that the marshal, the marshal of the Supreme Court came up and delivered a message to Donald Trump that the impeachment has already began and that he's not going to be able to pardon anybody.
She's not alone, but she was very good at it in the time. Boy, remember Louise Mensch? Remember the marshal of the Supreme Court? Holy hell, she was good at that shit. She was hilarious. And so Louise Mensch, in November, before the election, maybe November 7 or 8, she writes this story. Remember, the Alpha Bank thing breaks slowly, starting in October of 2016.
Major, I want to begin by asking you again about these reports between a Trump organization computer and a Russian bank, some type of connection there.
And then October 31st, 2016, New York Times said FBI was looking into Trump's Russian ties. They didn't find anything. The Alpha Bank thing turned out to be nothing.
And the New York Times is reporting, however, that the FBI never found direct links between the candidate and the Russian government.
I think there's good reason for it, but the most infuriating article in the history of electoral politics. And then also on the 31st, on the 1st, Franklin Foer writes his article about the Alpha Bank stuff. So the Alpha Bank stuff for the first time is fully public. This allegation that a marketing server in Pennsylvania used by the Trump organization is attempting to send messages to Alpha Bank. And so that is going haywire. And Louise Mensch in early November writes this, and I'm going to annotate as we go. Contrary to early reporting in the New York Times, and this is that infuriating story. Contrary to early reporting in the New York Times, Louise Mensch is going to fact check the New York Times, which cited FBI sources as saying that the agency did not believe that the private server in Donald Trump's Trump Tower, which connected to a Russian bank, had any nefarious purpose. It wasn't in Trump Tower.
Yes, what I reported was that my sources said, I should say at the outset, I don't have a piece of paper with a FISA warrant in front of me.
She mistook the story. The FBI's counterintelligence arm, sources say, redrew an earlier FISA court request around possible financial and banking offenses related to the server. The first request, which sources say, named Trump, was denied back in June, but the second was drawn more narrowly and was granted in October after evidence was presented of a server, possibly related to the Trump campaign, and its alleged links to two banks, SVB Bank and Russia's Alpha Bank. When the Times Story speaks of metadata. Sources suggest that a FISA warrant was granted to look at the full contents of emails and other related documents that may concern U.S. persons. Now, let's take a step back. What are we, 8 years later? This story is hilarious. Marshal of the Supreme Court. But she had something. And this is the really interesting thing. It's unclear where she got this. Somebody did feed her something real. She vomited it up. She didn't know what the hell she was talking about. You don't need a FISA, and I said this in real time, you don't need a FISA warrant to get metadata of any sort, not DNS, not call records, nothing. You don't need a FISA warrant for that. So she vomits it up. She places it in Trump Tower. People mostly ignore it. But I want to say one thing, right? So in retrospect, for a long time, we assumed that Louise Mensch was the first person to find out about the wiretap of Carter Page. That's what it sounds like.
What was interesting to me, and I think probably many of the other journalists who later corroborated my story, or at least reported the same thing, which includes the BBC and The Guardian, is that nobody that reported this warrant ever mentioned so much as a wiretap at all.
They got a wiretap. They got a FISA wiretap of Carter Page in October of 2016. After the Michael Sussman prosecution, my suspicion is she was told about some kind of warrant targeting Alpha Bank, like a real national security warrant targeting Alpha Bank. And the reason I say that is all the Michael Sussman records say, here are the reasons we don't think there's anything to this. And most of the reasoning goes to these two hack cyber security agents who just didn't even look at the data and said it's wrong. Didn't know what they were looking at. They weren't DNS experts, said it was wrong. Most of it goes to them. But there is one redacted reference in all of the records in the Michael Sussman case that makes it clear there's some kind of national security collection on Alpha Bank. And that was the thing that they relied on finally. My guess is somebody told her about a wiretap targeting Alpha Bank.
That a warrant was granted on the communications between two Russian banks. And specifically, permission was granted to the FBI to look at U.S. persons incidentally caught up in that investigation.
And she turned it in the story, and it was ridiculous. And now it's snowballs, right? Now it's snowballs. So you fast forward through the firing of Mike Flynn, and you get to the day on March 2nd, 2016, when Jeff Sessions recuses.
My staff recommended recusal. They said that since I had involvement with the campaign, I should not be involved in any campaign investigation. I have studied the rules and considered their comments and evaluation. I believe those recommendations are right and just.
This is when Trump says, I don't have a lawyer. My administration is over. He thought that his attorney general was going to be Bill Barr, what Bill Barr turned out to be. Jeff Sessions, who against all reason turned out to be his least awful attorney general, did the right thing, did the thing required by DOJ ethics and recused from the investigation. They did investigate whether he was covering up ties to Sergei Kislyak as well. It was mostly about his role on the campaign. And so at that point, Trump believed he could get rid of the investigation by firing Mike Flynn, and then learns that he doesn't have an attorney general who's just going to shut it down. And he panics, and he makes up the fact that the deep state has targeted him.
Either the deep state destroys America, or we destroy the deep state. That's the way it's got to be.
And all of a sudden, Trump's efforts to shut down this investigation keep failing. And people repurposed this insane, obviously false Louise Mensch story. First, Andy McCarthy did and said that FISA order was improper. Andy McCarthy will say anything for $1. And then Breitbart, Steve Bannon's rag, gets Mark Levin to say, oh my gosh.
We just reported the warrant that our sources told us existed, and we all reported the same thing. So the only people that reported a wiretap at Trump Tower were Breitbart News. Nobody else. And if there's been some leaks, maybe Steve Bannon or some of these other ex-Breitbart staffers have got something to answer to.
And he basically all he does is gives air to Louise Mensch's story again at a convenient time. And that's when on March 3rd, over and over again, Trump is tapped. They wiretapped me. Tapped. They tapped me. Tapped. Tapped.
Just 5 days ago, the president looked like he was turning it around. fewer protests in the streets, the stock market soaring, and that well-received speech to Congress. And now, whatever goodwill he had seemingly blown away in a Saturday morning tweet storm. Even by his own standards, the president leveled an extraordinary accusation against his predecessor, accusing former President Barack Obama of wiretapping him last October during the critical final weeks of the election.
And that is the birth of Trump's victimization. That is the birth of something Trump needed to be true from that point forward. And he found ways to make it true 2 or 3 times down the road. That is the birth of Trump's claim, which most maggots believe as if it's the 10 Commandments, that the deep state went out after Trump in 2016, that the deep state wiretapped Donald Trump in 2016 and tried to take him down. And that's where this assault on the deep state really comes from.
Thanks for listening to Ball of Thread. Expect a new episode about every 2 weeks until the election. To support this series and get answers to your questions with a bonus Q&A podcast, go to patreon.com/balloffthread. You can join us for as little as $1 a month. We appreciate your sharing this work with anyone who cares about the Constitution, and please consider giving us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts.